Okay, friends, here we go. We're getting started on chapter one of abnormal psychology. So just so that you understand how these videos are going to work, um, for each chapter, I will produce two or three different videos, each one between 10 and 20 minutes, that should cover the bulk of the things that I find most important in the chapter. I may skip over a few things. It won't be exactly like it is if we were in class and we were going through these one by one, but I'll try and pick the most important stuff that's most likely to be tested. But I may do a little jumping around in these slides, okay? In order to get us started today, we're going to talk about how we got to where we are here in psychology today in terms of our understanding of abnormal behavior and what's a disorder and how do we treat people and what does that all look like today. So we're going to cover some of this stuff today. So when we talk about abnormal psychology as a discipline or as a sort of subfield within psychology, we are essentially trying to understand, describe, and predict abnormal behaviors in humans. Now, this sounds like a great idea, right? We would like to understand why people are behaving in odd, unusual, unhelpful, harmful kinds of ways. But one of the difficulties that we run into right off the bat when it comes to abnormal psychology is defining what is abnormal. At different times in different places, what abnormal means has referred to a variety of very different behaviors, some of which we may engage in every single day and not even think about, and it's normally accepted now, but at one time or in one place or another was thought as being dangerous or harmful or deviant in some way. Um, you look at the timeline here of some of the terms that we use to talk about abnormal behavior. And some of these may surprise you, and they're not all in here. Of course, there's words that we use to describe abnormal behavior that aren't listed here. But instability, madness, insanity, crazy, unbalanced, all showed up fairly early on, and you get a little bit more clinical, or what we think of as clinical in our terms, as we move a little bit closer to right now, right? So we start talking about psychopathology right around 1850, mental illness towards the end of that century, mentally handicapped right around 1920, 1930, dysfunctional or impaired towards the later part of the 1900s. And you can see just in the language itself how we refer to abnormal behavior has changed. And if we can't even agree on what words to use, how are we going to even, it's an additional level of difficulty then to agree on the meaning behind those words, because we actually have a variety of different meanings when it comes to what is abnormal, right? You could think of behavior that doesn't happen very frequently as abnormal, right? That's one meaning for abnormal that is relevant. Something that is statistically unlikely, that's an abnormal behavior. Of course, that doesn't necessarily cover all of it, because there are behaviors that we would consider normal that still don't happen very frequently, right? So it is statistically unlikely to be the President of the United States, and yet that's normal behavior. Well, let's not get political, but we want to have a President of the United States. That is behavior that needs to occur, yet it doesn't happen very frequently. So that can't be the only marker of abnormality. Outside the cultural norm is another aspect of abnormality. Behavior that is not accepted by the people around you and is viewed as either unacceptable or simply not done, something that they don't view as the desired kind of behavior. That's another aspect of abnormal behavior. But once again, it can't be all of it, because societies change over time. And then what we view as culturally unacceptable is also going to change. Um, Now, this has more to say about abnormal behavior, and has even crept into some of our treatments over time, although we might not like to think of it that way. One good example of this is that homosexuality was actually included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychology, DSM, up until version 3 in the 1970s. That was considered aberrant, deviant, abnormal behavior. It was since removed, and cultural attitudes towards homosexuality have changed in the intervening decades. So that's no longer considered, um, you know, a problem behavior, at least by a growing portion of the population. And so you can see it's not just whether or not the people around you like what you're doing that it can be the sum total of what abnormal behavior is. These days, we try to focus most on the 4Ds, right? Deviance, meaning a departure from what is culturally expected, like I was talking about. That is one aspect to it. But then the others are equally important, if not even more important. The behavior needs to cause distress, um, either to the person who is engaging in the behavior or to the people around them. It needs to cause dysfunction. It has to, the engaging in abnormal behavior has to be something that prevents a person from engaging in socially appropriate behavior, in, keeping a job and maintaining their relationships and all of that stuff. If you can't do expected behaviors because you're engaging in the unexpected behaviors, that is dysfunction, right? And then danger. If you are exposing yourself or others to harm, that is the final aspect. And so abnormality sort of lives at the conjunction of all four of these D words, right? And like we talked about, uh, even taking all four of these into account, there's still going to be the societal norms to take into account. Because I can behave in one way here in the United States and have that be normal behavior, and if I go someplace else, it might be considered really problematic. Now, this isn't necessarily abnormal behavior that I'm going to describe right here, right now, but it does speak to social norms and to culture, which is um, the next thing to consider there. So I don't know if any of you guys have watched American Ninja Warrior. I used to love watching that show. I know it's still on. I just sort of have lost track of it. But the one that I'm thinking of, it's one of these sort of like gauntlet shows, right, where you have to do a bunch of physical tasks that are really difficult, and only the strongest and most physically adept, which is not me, can complete the gauntlet. Now, the one that I'm thinking of was actually an end of the season episode where it was the World Championships, and they had an American team, and I think an Australian team, and then a Japanese team. Now, after watching the show a few times, you get the sense of how it's supposed to go, right? The person, jumps from thing to thing and swings across the whatever, and they're always over a pool of water, and if they fail at whatever the task is, they fall in the water. And you get really used to seeing people mess up because these things are super hard. So somebody falls in the water, they come up out of the water grimacing and maybe cussing, you can't hear them because they're far away, and they may slap the water. But after a few seconds, they get their emotions under control, and they wave to everybody, and they hop out of the pool, and then they have to have the post-failure interview with the person who's like, "How come you suck?" And then they still have to be nice about it. That's what you expect from that show as an American. What was interesting was to see the Japanese team as they went through these gauntlets. And I remember specifically one of the guys who was trying to do something over water. I don't remember, but he fell, and he fell into the water, and he came up out of the water screaming. He hopped out of the pool, fell to his knees, shook his fists at the sky, and wept. And I was like, "What are you doing, dude? This is just a game. It's just a competition. It's fine. You're embarrassing yourself." Except he wasn't, right? This was according to his culture and where he grew up and the way he had been taught to behave. That's how you are supposed to behave when you let your team down. You are supposed to let them know that you are very, very sorry, and that is a real problem, right? So he was behaving culturally in a normal way, but because he was in a different place, in a different context, suddenly that behavior looked very abnormal, to my eyes at least, as someone who is less familiar with Japanese cultural norms. And so he really stood out, right? And so you can sort of see there the influences of norms, culture, and context, right? Okay, now another thing I failed to mention, context can go beyond just, oh, I'm in another country. There are some behaviors that are appropriate to engage in certain contexts and not in others, right? Um, that where it depends on the situation that you're in, whether that is appropriate behavior, right? It's fine to strip down to your underwear when you're on the beach and walk around mostly nude, but do that on campus or in a restaurant and see how that goes over, right? Normal in one context, abnormal in the other. So none of these definitions of abnormality apply perfectly to every situation and to every behavior. But it's sort of you look at the bulk of the criteria and say, okay, does this fit in to what I expect to see in the situation, or does it not? Is it causing harm, or is it not? And if you look across those 4Ds, if there is enough trouble going on, that's considered abnormal behavior, and you sort of have to apply the label on a case-by-case basis, because it's really hard to be consistent, because we are humans and we have complex, chaotic interaction systems, and so what works in one situation is not going to work in another. Okay, we want to identify and understand abnormal behavior, not just so that we can go, hey, that's weird, get away from me, even though that's what a lot of us do, but rather so that we can help out, right? The end goal in psychology is to help people function well and be happy in their lives. And so when a person is experiencing abnormal behavior and disordered behavior, we want to try and help them get to a spot where they can fit in a little bit better, accomplish what they want and need to, and not experience whatever distress they are currently experiencing. Now, if you'll notice, normal behavior, and figuring out what normal behavior is, runs into exactly the same problems as defining abnormal behavior. It's just the flip side of the coin, right? And so understanding the shift from abnormal behavior towards more normal behavior, again, this is a complicated thing to try to nail down in every scenario, and we sort of have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Now, across pretty much all contexts, though, when you're talking about treatment of abnormal behavior, there are a certain number of salient characteristics that always show up. There needs to be someone who needs help, and there needs to be someone who is giving help. A healer, a therapist, a clinician, a doctor, something of that sort, who then interacts with the person in need of assistance in some way that helps change their behavior. Now, that can, depending on the context and depending on the healer, depending on the sufferer, can take a bunch of different formats. Maybe that is, you can go to the sort of standard media representation of therapy, which is, somebody sitting on a reclining couch in a darkened room across the desk from somebody who's taking notes and talking about their childhood, right? That is a form of therapy. There are plenty of others, right? There may be someone guiding someone in the creation of art or music, or there may be a group of people sitting in a circle talking about their difficulties and providing advice to each other. Pretty much taking a walk up into the mountains and either discussing or not discussing or building something or taking care of animals, or there's as many different types of treatments as there are people providing that treatment. And so despite all of those differences, what you have in common is the presence of someone who needs help and the presence of someone providing help. And it seems that, at least in our society in these days, most people need some kind of help. Turns out we have a complicated, difficult to navigate society. in which a lot of people feel distress and experience dysfunction. I know I could probably benefit from some therapy. I have in the past. And probably quite a few of you could or have as well. Um, and if you look at it that way, if we're all experiencing abnormal behavior, is it how abnormal is it really? It's just in a bunch of different directions, right? We all have our own particular problems and seek out the help that is most beneficial, most useful to us. Okay, that's all I want to say on that topic. In our next little video, we'll move on to some of the history of abnormal behavior and treatment.